David Kurzhal, the Viking Samurai, is with us again. It's a pleasure, David.
Mine. Glad to be here.
Great, great. David, you're probably one of the most famous YouTubers who covers the action and martial arts genre. So you're a bit of an expert. So we're talking about No Retreat, No Surrender. Tell us how important is this film for the history of the martial arts film?
It's extremely important for many reasons. For one, it's of course the first appearance of Jean-Claude Van Damme. This was before Bloodsport, well before Bloodsport. So Kurt McKinney, even though he never became a martial art movie star, he could have, and it's interesting to go back into his history because he had recently worked on The Last Kumite, but that was only his third martial arts film. This was his first, No Retreat, No Surrender. Then, of course, he worked on a movie in the 90s with Cynthia Rothrock, but he never ended up doing the No Retreat, No Surrender sequel, and neither did Van Damme. But the movie is most important, I believe, because Jean Claude Van Damme became pretty much, you can't quite say as big as Bruce Lee, but after Bruce Lee, there were two guys, at least in the American martial arts films, that became huge. They were Jean Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal. So getting any one of their like origin films, to see him like in the beginning is extremely important in film history and martial arts movie cinema specifically.
Yeah, and the ghost of Bruce Lee is of course present in the film, which is also very important.
Yeah, when I seen the film as a kid, that's what stuck out. It was the ghost of Bruce Lee, and it was Kurt McKinney when he did that backflip and hit Van Damme, even though that wasn't really Kurt McKinney who did that stunt.
Hmm. Yeah. So when you were a kid and you were watching this film, did you think that was Bruce Lee? Because I probably did when I when I first watched the film.
That's a good question because like the first time I seen it, I was probably like 8 years old, and I had heard of Bruce Lee, even though I don't even really remember like seeing Bruce Lee movies at that time. But it was just like that name is so big that kids would reference and talk about Bruce Lee. So even if you never seen a Bruce Lee movie, you like heard of him, right? So when I see No Retreat, No Surrender for the first time, I don't know if I really thought that was Bruce Lee or not, to be honest, because I was so young, and I had never seen a Bruce Lee film. I was just, oh, okay, that's Bruce Lee, I guess.
Yeah, so the suspension of disbelief worked out, I guess.
Sure,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. So, what did you think of the film as a kid? I mean, did something stick out for you? Was there something special about the film?
Yeah, it was just fun. It was entertaining. I didn't realize how cheesy it was until I was older because it's that Hong Kong style. Their acting is so different than American style acting, you know? And I mean, for what it is, it's great. You don't really notice that kind of stuff as a kid. And when I watched it as a kid, I didn't know who John Claude Van Damme was. Like I thought, the hero, Kurt McKinney, was the most impressive in the film. But then when you watch it later, I mean, Kurt McKinney is a great martial artist, but I think most people who watch martial arts films would say Van Damme's at a higher level, at least cinematically, the way he moves, the gracefulness, the ballet background, and karate and all that. So when I watch it now older, you know, you really see all that potential that Van Damme had, and you could kind of realize that it's no surprise that this guy became a big star, at least in the action martial arts genre. Whereas Kurt McKinney, he never really came to Hollywood to be an action guy. At least I don't think he did. And he ended up doing like a lot of more normal acting roles, especially in soap operas. So he's an amazing actor. But it's kind of funny how he ended up in No Retreat, No Surrender, because at that time, martial art movies were starting to get big, but he didn't even go out there to become like the martial art movie star like so many other guys did. And that's why he didn't really do more martial arts films until that one with Cynthia in the 90s, and then much, much later, The Last Kumite. But that's only because the producer, as we all know, Sean, loves No Retreat, No Surrender, which I think is called Karate Tiger out where you guys are.
Yes.
And, he had reached out to Kurt and said, hey, I'm doing this homage film to these old school martial art films. and we got to get you in it. And the rest was history.
Yeah. So, did you have a chance to talk to Kurt McKinney about his experience or on No Retreat, No Surrender when you worked together on the last Kumite?
In person, when I worked with him, not really. But later, when I interviewed him, yeah, we talked about it quite a bit because I knew the audience would really want to get those stories. And I was curious myself. But on set, there's a lot going on. And, we talked more about just life, like, because he's still in great shape, talked about working out, talked about, some of his film history and things like that.
Yeah. So, how was working with him?
It was amazing. It was great. He was giving me acting tips. I always try to pick up stuff, like Billy Blanks was giving me fight choreography tips. Kurt was giving me acting tips. Everybody was so nice, so helpful. And if you watch the last Kumite, our characters do not like each other, which is funny. And it was fun to play that, because I really like the guy in real life, of course. So
Yeah. Yeah. So, you finally had a chance to talk to Kurt McKinney about the film, and but you didn't talk to Van Damme yet. Did you?
that's
Did you ever
funny.
try?
Um, I mean, he would be a great guest, obviously, right? He would be a great, amazing guest. I know a couple of people that know him, but most of the guests that I get, they want to be on the show and someone says, "Hey, I can get you this guy." And usually I'll do it that I've never that aggressive in trying to get my interviews. I think it'll like naturally come. I know people that know him. I'll probably end up meeting him in person someday. And then it'll just make sense to talk about doing an interview at that time. Somebody like Van Damme and also somebody like Seagal, who I plan to meet up with in person and become friends with over the last couple of years, these kind of like things that I'd like to do with them on YouTube is more than like a Zoom interview. Like I want to spend time with them and interview them in person because, I think it's somebody on that level like Van Damme and Seagal, if given the opportunity, I need to sit down with them. I need to, how like Jesse Enkamp, the karate nerd, he did an interview with Seagal. He trained with him. He ate with him. He interviewed him. Like spending a day with him. If somebody got to do that with Van Damme, it'd be a lot more interesting, because there are so many Van Damme interviews online, and people asked him pretty much everything under the sun. Like we know his story. We know how when he came out here and kind of how his film career went and the struggles that he had with some substance abuse and then his comeback and all that. Like all those stories are out there. So if I just interviewed him on Zoom, it's just going to kind of be like the same stuff, that's already been done. Whereas I feel like if I ever got time to spend, time with him in person and train with him and sit down and have like a real discussion, there could be something more interesting there, more substance for the audience, something unique. So that's what I'm hoping eventually happens on the channel. And I do plan to do that with Skull because I already have that connection and have talked to him numerous times, of course.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. And you're right, that would be a great concept. Yeah. Not just another interview.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so as you already mentioned, No Retreat, No Surrender is called Karate Tiger in Germany, which is quite funny because they continued to name films that have nothing to do with the franchise Karate Tiger. Karate Tiger 3, 4, 5, and up to 10. 10.
Yes, 10.
10. There are
Wow.
10. And of course, No Retreat, No Surrender, there are only two.
Mhm.
Yes.
Three.
Well, there's three.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's
that's right.
Blood Brothers, I think, is the third
Yeah.
one, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So
Best of the best is Karate Tiger 4 in Germany. Best of the best is Karate Tiger 4. King of the Kickboxer with Billy Blanks is Karate Tiger 5 in Germany.
Yeah, that's funny. It's just such a popular franchise out there, even though they have nothing to do with each other. It's kind of like the Blood Fist movies, where Don the Dragon Wilson was like in 8 of them, but at least he was in all of them, even though he plays different characters, which is weird. But because they make movie or money off of the title, they could just keep, the audience is familiar with that title, and they're probably gonna bare minimum make X amount of dollars, so they just run with it. But it's crazy what they did with Karate Tiger. If there's 10 of them, and best of the best is so amazing, but that ends up being Karate Tiger 4. That's funny.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, it's maybe because of the Karate Kid, because No Retreat, No Surrender was supposed to be like, I mean, I won't say a rip-off, but it's like an answer, to the Karate Kid franchise. I think when we talked to Bay Logan about No Retreat, No Surrender, he mentioned that the director he saw the Karate Kid and he thought, well, we can we can do a better job, doing the same story. So, and that's how it came. That's how it came together. I think it's fascinating. I mean, when you compare the two films and what they do, differently. It's funny.
Oh, they're like night and day, the difference. The Karate Kid is such a brilliant screenplay, amazing actors, real heartfelt story. Feels, everybody could kind of resonate with that classic. I mean, I know No Retreat, No Surrender, that storyline, the classic bullying. You go into karate, you learn how to fight, and then you become the hero at the end of the day and beat up the bully. But the Karate Kid is so well done as a drama, whereas No Retreat, No Surrender, it's a lot more spectacular as far as the martial arts go, because you have guys like Van Damme and Kurt in there, and a lot of other great kickboxers,
Mhm.
right? A lot of other great kickboxers in there.
Yeah, and and Corey Yun, he because Van Damme wasn't such a big star back then. Corey Yun thought, he could use him differently than Van Damme would do later. He was able to do stuff that he wouldn't do later on. That because later on he would do much more edits. Much more edits between the fights and so on. But in No Retreat, No Surrender, there are all the sequences. Yeah.
Yeah, with that Hong Kong kind of nonstop, and they got a certain rhythm. Whereas Van Damme, because he didn't have any creative control on No Retreat, No Surrender, he just kind of did what, obviously the director and editors and filmmakers wanted. Now, with his starring role in Bloodsport, they had an initial cut, an initial edit that the story goes, nobody really liked it. So he went in the editing room himself and started cutting up the fight scenes. And that became the Van Damme style that we've seen in Kickboxer and a lot of those early films like Double Impact, Lionheart, Death Warrant. And he had that unique style. There was just something about that looking back at his filmography, I mean, that was as interesting as he knew exactly how to display himself because nobody else really has that style or has done that style, but that's like his own dash of like, creative genius towards editing. And people either love it or hate it. They'll see that same kick 5 times in different angles in slow mo and he's posing. I loved it growing up. I know other people like, oh, they're not fans, especially if you're a fan of the Hong Kong style. It's completely different. But I've always loved the Van Damme style, and that's his own creative genius as far as editing goes, because he just knew how to showcase himself, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that, No Retreat, No Surrender and Bloodsport, all those films, they kind of started off the martial arts craze in the US and in Europe. And now we have films like The Last Kumite and Life After Fighting and Black Creek. And now it seems uh like a little bit of a comeback for
Mhm.
these sorts of films. What do you think about that?
I think it's great. Uh, all these films, I mean, even back in the day, they were lower budget, and of course, they're lower budget these days. I think the films, in a lot of ways, in some ways, they're better than they were in the past because I think we've learned from those mistakes where they put a little more attention, not a whole lot, because some complaints were for the last Kumite where there were some plot holes in the script and all that, but it captured the essence of that era in the 80s. But I think more attention, at least a little bit more, um is put towards like the story and the characters, like the life after fighting, for example, right? That's I've seen parts of it and I've seen the trailer, of course, but people who told me about it, I need to watch it because people who told me about it, they rave about how great that was. And even with the last Kumite, there's a lot of really good feedback. It's just a fun movie. So yeah, there's a resurgence of sorts. I don't think like the martial arts genre will ever be as big as it was back then, because that's all we had. That was all our exposure to the martial arts. And there was something almost like mystical about it, where, they would even say blood sports based on a true story. We thought all that stuff was real back in the day, whereas now, we know it's not. And but if we do want to see the real stuff, we could just watch the UFC, we could watch MMA, we could watch all this other stuff. So you're exposed to the martial arts a lot more with like real fighting. You weren't back in the day. You only had the movies, and that's one reason, that people got into those movies. But now you have the real fighting you can watch, and then you have the movies you can watch, and a lot of like the magical, mystical stuff about the martial arts. It's harder for the suspension of disbelief, knowing after you've watched 100 UFC fights, if that stuff would really work in movies.
Yeah, yes, right. We've seen it all, so it's and so many choices to watch, and we have this whole rich history of martial arts films and action films, and yeah, it's it's almost too much. So, what do you think a film needs to, I mean, to hit that 80s, 90s sweet spot?
The score, the music, there's just something that the last Kumite did a pretty good job, because they got the guys like, Paul Herzog and Stan Bush to do the score. So Sean, he knew what he wanted, and he got what he wanted basically. And he put a big focus on the score and the music, and it worked out. But you need great training montages. The last Kumite had some pretty good ones. I don't think they were quite as good as training montages in Kickboxer, to be honest. you know. But they were good for what they were. But you basically really need that amazing score, that soundtrack that you want to keep listening to even when you do your own workouts. And you need training montages that you want to go to the gym. Like these movies got people, they were more than entertainment. They got people doing karate, they got people working out. You watch the training montage in Rocky 4, I could watch that 1,000 times and still want to go to the gym. It just doesn't get old.
That's right. Yeah, I was just thinking about Rocky 4. Yeah, it's
Probably
fun.
the best ever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, they made a TV spin-off of the Karate Kid series, which is Cobra Kai, which big success. Do you think something similar would have worked with No Retreat, No Surrender?
I do, and I know they're working on it. Like Keith Strandberg, who created it, is working on it, and I know Kurt McKinney's interested. They talked to some other named martial artists. I don't think Van Damme will be involved, at least not yet, because Cobra Kai, they started bringing back some of the older characters, from the movies, and as the show became more popular, it made a lot of sense for them to want to get involved. So if they do end up doing like a series and rebooting it, then and it becomes popular, it's something that maybe even Van Damme would want to get involved with. Now, it doesn't quite have as rich of a history as the Karate Kid, because we had Karate Kid 1, we had Karate Kid 2, we had Karate Kid 3, at least those three to draw upon, right? And then of course you had the next Karate Kid and the remake, which those are what they are. But at least you had a rich history in three films, whereas No Retreat, No Surrender, you really only had one. I mean, technically, yeah, they made a sequel. They didn't get Van Damme or Kurt McKinney, and the storyline, it has nothing to do with the first one, at all. And then, the third one, and then obviously in Germany, they kept running up to Ted. So even though there seems like there's a lot of them, there's really only one movie to draw upon, to make a series out of, which makes it a little bit harder because you only have so many characters. Where at least in the Karate Kid, the original trilogy, you had a lot of characters in those three movies to kind of bring into a series. So
Yeah, that's right. By the way, I think you should do an interview with Thomas Ian Griffith because he's had such an interesting career. I mean, he wrote his own movies, like Excessive Force. I mean,
I love that movie.
yeah, me
Yeah.
too. He's an interesting guy, I think.
Did you guys interview him?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Okay, I got to interview him. Yeah, he would be a great guy. Actually, he was part of one of my videos where I did a few years ago, a very popular series. It was the top 5 martial art movie stars who weren't Jean-Claude Van Damme or Steven Seagal. And these five, I limited the list of guys who at least had movies that went to the theater, at least one, because there's so many guys that were strictly straight to video, and that's like a separate list. But guys who had a real shot at becoming, like Seagal or Van Damme career wise, because they were with the bigger studios. And Thomas Ian Griffith was on that list, the top five that I had, because of movies like Excessive Force that went to the theater, good production values, great cast. James Earl Jones and Lance Henriksen, for example, were in that movie.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this movie had it all. I mean, he should have become the next big thing,
He could have. There was potential there. Yeah, and in that list of five that I had made, I talked about their careers and what ended up happening, because another guy that was on there, we mentioned Best of the Best, earlier, Philip Bree. He had a lot of potential. Best of the Best, I remember in part 2 specifically, went to the movie theater, could have been a huge star, was there at the right time. But yeah, man, it's so challenging, because there, like I mentioned, there were really only two guys that broke out and had a real career in the theaters as far as the action martial art genre. And that was Van Damme and Seagal, where they pretty much had a solid career of movie theater hits for 10 years.
Jeff
Good
Speakman
run.
is also on your list. Jeff Speakman.
Jeff Speakman was on that list too, yeah, with Perfect Weapon, of course. And I had Mark Dacascos on the list, because of Only the Strong, movies like that. Double Dragon even went to the theater, though that ended up hurting his career, unfortunately. Wasn't that good.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about Van Damme. He made No Retreat, No Surrender. He made, Bloodsport and Kickboxer. And after that, he kind of evolved, and he didn't do any of those, pure martial arts films, although he could have. And he never wanted to do sequels. And like Sheldon Lettish wanted to do the Lionheart sequel, but he never wanted to do it. I mean, it could have been a franchise for him.
It could have been. I could see where Van Damme's coming from, because he had, he really wanted to be more than just the martial art guy. And then he was doing a lot of action movies that incorporated some martial arts, but less and less as time went by. And he did that movie Nowhere to Run, where it didn't really have any martial arts. It had a great fight at the end, though. Like, I love the fight at the end of Nowhere to Run. So it's kind of like the same thing with Steven Seagal. It's they didn't want to be like confined to a box. I think they really wanted to be taken serious as like real actors. They wanted to probably get to the level of Brad Pitt, for example, where they could do action movies, but they want to build the audience where you just want to watch them because they could play interesting characters and interesting roles. I think they just didn't want to be confined to that box. Even though they were working with bigger studios and had bigger productions, there's always kind of that stigma, because there were so many like straight to video martial arts films, but those movies were always a lower tier than the more serious films. Like, those would never win an Academy Award, for example. And I think they just had these dreams of being just the big movie star, not just in that box of, well, you're the martial art movie star and that's it. So it would make sense that Van Damme would get his start doing those pure martial arts films, those tournament films. And I know Muhammad Kisi, because I interviewed him, of course, worked with him on The Last Kumite as well. And, he was the guy kind of pushing Van Damme to do more of the pure martial arts films, because he knew Van Damme's talent growing up and was like, you're perfect for this stuff, which the audience, we knew that too, and we wanted more. See, that's the problem. It's like you watch a Van Damme movie, you want to literally see him kick butt. Like, we expect that. So when he tries to break away, he could lose a lot of the core audience, so it's hard to make that transition. But I just think he wanted to be taken serious as like, a real actor, more than just, oh, well, this guy could fight on screen and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, just like Seagal, I think he aimed high, when you did On Deadly Ground,
Yeah.
because I think that was his he tried to win an Oscar with that one. I guess I guess that was the plan.
There's a book called Who is Michael Ovitz? Michael Ovitz was that power agent that got Seagal started. And he talks about On Deadly Ground and, that Seagal he just wanted more. He thought he would direct such an amazing film. And you even see Seagal on interviews talking about, like, when Arsenio Hall asks him, will we ever see you in a movie where you don't fight? And he's like, yes, I would love to just, play a role where I don't have to beat somebody up. Um, Unfortunately, On Deadly Ground, I thought it was entertaining. It didn't really perform at the box office. And then, because of that, they're obviously not going to offer him more directing jobs and they got to bring him back. Well, okay, because that came out right after Under Siege and that was his biggest hit, right? So he had his 4 movies, which were huge, and it just kept building the momentum. Above the Law, Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, and then Out for Justice. And then he built a big audience with that. And then Under Siege came out, and that kind of got him to the mainstream. That's when, like, the average person who wasn't really even into action or martial art films, like, were fans of Seagal because of that. So then he's like riding high off this peak, and then of course directs On Deadly Ground, which underperformed. So then they go back to Under Siege, and they do Under Siege 2: Dark Territory, which wasn't even initially a sequel to Under Siege, but they figured, well, Under Siege was such a big hit, let's kind of like how Karate Tiger, there's 10 of them, let's put that title on Dark Territory, but at least he played the same character, Casey Ryback. So
Yeah.
But yeah, these guys, and it makes sense for an actor to not want to be confined to a box because you want to explore and you want to try different things. So I could see why Van Damme and Skull definitely wanted to branch out. Like even me, even though I'm just getting my start, like in these martial arts and action films, I would even love to do a comedy or a drama. I don't know if I ever get the chance, but see, even this early, like I'm thinking of other type of acting roles later.
Yeah, I think nowadays I don't think it's that strict anymore, because I mean a guy like Brent Foster, he did lots of stuff before he directed himself in Life After Fighting. He did this huge TV series with Michael Bay, for example, and he did some genre stuff, and then he just makes his own martial arts movie, and he's not afraid of it. I think typecasting was a big issue back then, but nowadays I think it's much freer. That's my, I don't know, my feeling.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think typecasting will always be a thing because once somebody becomes a fan of you, that's what they expect. It's funny because it even happens in the realm of YouTube. Like somebody may start a YouTube channel specifically focusing on a certain topic, and a lot of YouTubers will want to branch out later, and they'll lose a lot of that initial audience. But then they'll maintain like their core and maybe start rebuilding with the new audience. But see, even people on YouTube want to branch out. I've noticed, but they're almost typecast. Like, well, I only want to watch his videos when he talks about this.
Yeah. So did you ever want to branch out?
You mean on YouTube?
Yes.
Kind of. I mean, I love the 80s and 90s martial arts movies and action. And there's a dedicated audience. It's not the biggest audience, whereas like there's a lot of interesting topics, like Joe Rogan, for example.
Mhm.
He's lucky because he's got an audience where he could talk about UFC fights, he could talk about aliens, he could talk about psychedelic drugs, he could talk about politics, and these are hot trending topics. So of course those videos are going to get a lot of views because that's what is people are talking about right now. For example, a couple of weeks ago when Trump got shot in the ear, that's a hot topic. It would be weird for me to talk about on my channel, but those are the kind of videos that would get hundreds of thousands of views because everybody wants to know, like, oh, what happened exactly? How do you break that down, and all that kind of stuff. So part of me kind of wants to branch out to like that Joe Rogan route where I could talk about boxing matches or MMA. You know, I could always bring guests to talk about these 80s and 90s action films, but I could talk about like that Trump shooting, for example, or other craziness going on in the world that just happen to be hot topics, you know. I would love to do that in a big podcast because that's the only way you would get like 1 million subscribers or even maybe 10 million when you're tackling all that kind of stuff. Whereas in the realm of what we do, there's a hardcore dedicated audience, but it's such a small niche, you know, of the of people that watch YouTube.
Yeah, yeah, I get it. Yeah. Yeah, so you already made some action films. You did The Last Kumite, you did Bloodstorm, which will come out, I guess.
It'll be out soon. I just heard from the director he'll pretty
Oh,
much be finished with it like in a week
oh.
because he's doing the final edit.
So when will we see the trailer?
I'll give it to you guys as soon as I can. Hopefully he'll cut together a nice trailer around the time he finishes the final edit, you know. Hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah, so you did movies, and you already had your first professional fight, and you have another fight coming up. Um, so what's the difference, you know, between a real fight and a fight in the movies?
Well, the movie fights, of course, look a lot better because you're trying to make them look cinematic, you know. I mean, sometimes, depending on the film or the style or even the director, they may want something to look grittier and a little uglier and not as clean and polished, right? But in general, yeah, the movies are just more cinematic and you're really like going wide with your punches, you know, you're telegraphing your kicks, you know, and that's all fine. Stuff that you can never get away with in a real fight. You know, everything's short, tight, you know, and it wouldn't look good. It could look okay on camera depending on how they shoot it, but in general, it's just the everything's bigger in film and everything looks better and sounds better. It's just like amplified, you know, like you know how it is when you watch a movie and then you see it or maybe even partake in it in the real world and it's never like as spectacular. It's never as cool.
Yeah, but you know, the training for a real fight is, I guess, it's a real training, right? You don't just you know, stay in shape, but you have to, you know, ante it up or something.
Yeah, for sure. And then like, you know, the training in movies, for example, you take kickboxer or blood sport. I mean, kickboxer and blood sport specifically, the way they stretch, you know, how they force Van Damme into the splits in those movies. That looks great on film, you know, but that's horrible in real life. You probably pull something. You want to do the opposite. You want to relax and almost meditate and flow into that stretch very in a relaxed state, as opposed to he's like being tortured into the splits. It's the complete opposite of what you need to do if you want to do the splits in real life.
So you don't think those you know, those fight scenes in No Retreat, No Surrender or Bloodsport, they're not very realistic. You think they're more artificial and cinematic.
For the most part, I mean, there's some stuff that you could implement, you know. I mean, the main thing that people need to get from the films is the motivation. And if they want to recreate some of those training sequences, that's fun. But the real training is always it's not as interesting to watch. It's not as cinematic, you know, like the stuff that Kurt McKinney's he's doing the punches with the resistance bands that they had. You could do stuff like that, you know. I mean, I wouldn't hang upside down from a basketball court rim, for example. That's a little dangerous. But, you know, you could implement some of this stuff, but you know, movies are always going to over exaggerate. You know, like for example, when they're training in Rocky Four, even though it's in my opinion, the greatest training montage ever. It doesn't really make sense for a lifter to, especially training for a fight, to be doing those like heavy power lifts because you could easily get injured when you're training for a fight, you know. And if you're doing max weights, it's not the smartest thing. I don't necessarily think anyone needs to run up a mountain, you know, but it looks so good in a movie.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to come back to No Retreat, No Surrender, I mean, you already mentioned the film. I mean, it's not a perfect film. It's not, you know, it's not as I think meticulously composed as The Karate Kid or something, but still it's still very charming. And
Yeah, there's a certain charm about it. Exactly.
yeah, it's still very much alive. And I think it's funny that it's still kind of holds up. I mean, it's not Bloodsport or it's not The Karate Kid, but there's something about it. I mean, it's still there, and you know, people love it. And you know, Sean's putting together some, you know, some screenings in Germany with you know, with Kurt McKinney and Keith Strandberg and some of the other guys. So yeah, what do you think about that?
I think it's great. I mean, it's a cult classic. And like you mentioned, I mean, it just has a certain charm about it. There's a certain quality of like, yeah, it's got its flaws and it, you know, it's not the perfect film and there's cheesy parts in it. And even when it came out, you know, Kurt McKinney wasn't even that happy with it because I think he thought, you know, coming out here to be like more of a real serious actor, and I'm sure he watched The Karate Kid, and you know that's so dramatic but played realistically. Whereas, you know, that Hong Kong style is just so over the top with the acting, and you know, I don't know how it comes across in Germany, but when people watch it in America, they're like, yeah, you know, it's as far as the acting goes, like, oh, that's interesting. It's so over the top, you know. And I know the directors because I talked to like Cynthia, who's done so many Hong Kong films, and she just says the director is like, no, go bigger, go bigger. You know, it's so unnatural, but that's what they want, you know, and that's what they got. So yeah, I think it's great that it's a cult classic though, because there's so many iconic moments like the ghost of Bruce Lee. Then there's that backflip kick, and I still remember that the first time I watched it as a kid. That backflip kick, that was so cool. And then Van Damme in the white suit doing his cool, you know, stuff you would see in so many other of his movies with his jumping split spin kick and his multi roundhouse kicks and all of that. And yeah, so many moments that are memorable, which is what you need for like a cult film, right? It just like those memorable moments. I think the last Kumite qualities, in my opinion. Oh, did that freeze? Are you guys?
Yeah, yeah, you
Hang on.
freeze there for a moment, you know, just before you were
Oh,
starting
yeah,
to
I'm not
talk
sure
about
what's up with the internet.
the last Kumite.
Oh, okay. So you got most of it. Oh, I was gonna say, I believe the last Kumite, looking back, looking years ahead, it'll end up becoming a cult film. It's got a lot of those charming qualities. It's not the perfect film, but it is memorable. There's a lot of sequences in there that definitely are memorable.
Yeah, yeah, let's hope so. David, it's been a pleasure as always. It's great talking to you.
Oh, yeah, thanks guys. I love being part of this bonus features and part of the martial art film history. I started the Viking Samurai YouTube channel to honor these films, and you know, I build a good subscriber base because you know, guys like you and a lot of others, they grew up watching these films and they become part of our lives. So it's almost like the YouTube channel, and I know your bonus features you do on these is in these movies themselves. It's like a time machine that brings people back to when they were a kid, and you know, a lot of good memories.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis.
All right, thanks guys.
Have a good one.
Yep, you too.